So, what if the greatest mind in history never actually, wrote anything down, yet somehow shaped how we think, how we ask questions, even how we learn for literally thousands of years?
It's a fascinating starting point, isn't it?
It really is. Welcome, everyone, to a deep dive into, well, one of history's most enigmatic figures, Socrates. Now, you've given us this incredible stack of sources: ancient biographies, philosophical deep dives, historical accounts, even some pretty pointed modern
Yeah,
critiques.
it's quite a mix. Gives you a real sense of the challenge.
Absolutely. Because while, most of us know the name Socrates, the full picture, his life, his revolutionary method, his almost mythical impact, it often gets kind of murky, lost in layers of interpretation.
Loss is a good word for it.
So our mission for you today is to unpack these sources you've gathered. Not just to figure out who Socrates was, but maybe why he mattered so much back then and even now. And honestly, to tackle this fascinating problem of how we can even know the real Socrates. Okay, let's unpack this. When we talk ancient philosophy, Socrates is like the first name, right? But what's truly wild is how little we actually know directly from him.
That's precisely the paradox.
Mhm.
It's what makes him so endlessly compelling. He's the cornerstone of Western philosophy, no question.
Right.
Yet, zero writings. Nothing. Which means, like you said, we're forced to piece together his life, his thought, entirely through other people's eyes, through their words.
Students, critics.
Exactly. Admirers, detractors, people who maybe just didn't quite get him. And that, as we'll definitely dig into with this material, raises that huge question: who Socrates are we actually meeting? Is it the man? Or is it a reflection distorted through all these different lenses?
A fundamental challenge, really.
It really is. It's something you always grapple with when looking at ancient figures, where those direct, unfiltered accounts are just so incredibly rare.
Makes total sense. Okay, so if we're going to peel back those layers, understand this guy Socrates, we absolutely have to start with the world that made him, right? His Athens.
You have to. Context is everything here.
He was born around 470, maybe 469 BCE.
Yeah.
Right at this hinge moment for Athens, just after the Persian Wars. And this wasn't some quiet university town. You have to picture a city just buzzing with energy, rebuilding like mad. A real pressure cooker of change.
A crucible. Yeah, that's a good word.
Yeah.
Think about Athens right after they'd miraculously stood up to the massive Persian Empire. The city walls, breached before, now being rebuilt, brick by painstaking brick. A symbol of sheer resilience.
You could almost see it.
And the harbor, the Piraeus, bustling, a total hub of activity. Ships, merchants, goods pouring in from everywhere. It was the economic engine driving the city.
And money, lots of it.
Oh, yeah. Literal silver flowing in from the Delos League. These were basically contributions from allied cities that Athens, being the top dog, was, well, let's say, redirecting. And this massive influx of cash wasn't just for warships. It was funding this extraordinary, almost unbelievable cultural explosion. This was the absolute start of what we call Athens' golden age. No doubt about it.
So not just abstract ideas, but real, tangible stuff happening everywhere.
Totally tangible. The foundations for the Parthenon, were being laid up on the Acropolis. Imagine the scale of that project, the sheer ambition.
Wow.
Down in the theaters, guys like Aeschylus and Sophocles were inventing tragedy as we know it, grappling with these huge human questions in ways that, amazingly, still hit home today.
Right, still read them, still perform them.
Exactly. And even public spaces were getting a facelift. The stoas, the covered walkways in the agora, the main square, the marketplace, they were being decorated with these amazing frescoes by artists like Polygnotos. It was just this convergence of wealth, art, ambition, ideas, all happening in one place. That was the Athens Socrates grew up in. Confident, maybe even a bit arrogant, but definitely changing deep down.
And it wasn't just buildings and art, was it? There was this huge social shift happening underneath all that gold paint. The whole idea of nobility, of virtue, excellence, whatever you want to call it, was changing fast. It wasn't just about who your dad was anymore.
Precisely. And that was a massive change. Traditionally, arte was tied to the old landowning families, military skill, inherited status. But in this new democratic Athens, what mattered was civic virtue. What you actually did for the polis, for the city-state.
How you contributed.
Exactly. If you wanted to get ahead, have influence, suddenly your ability to speak, to persuade people in the assembly, to argue effectively in court, that became the key skill. But virtue itself was kind of moving, from the battlefield, proving your courage, to the speaker's platform, wielding words.
Which, as one of the analyses you gave us points out, is exactly where the sophists came in, right? This created a huge market for teachers who could give people those skills.
Yes, the sophists, often misunderstood, but they were fundamentally practical people. Skilled teachers, often traveling from city to city, offering paid lessons, rhetoric, argument, public speaking.
The skills you needed.
The skills you absolutely needed in a city where speaking well meant power and influence. They became crucial figures, shaping politicians, helping ordinary citizens navigate this complex democracy. They were kind of the original communications consultants, teaching the art of persuasion in this new world.
And right in the middle of all this noise and change, there's Socrates. Definitely not from the elite. Born to a sculptor, Sophroniscos, and a midwife, Phenerete, grew up in a workshop. That tells you a lot about his starting point, doesn't it? A world away from the wealthy kids he'd later talk with.
His background is so important for understanding him. Unlike the aristocrats with inherited money and time, Socrates came from working stock, and his education shows that.
Right.
He probably had some access to the usual stuff, maybe learned the lyre, some writing, physical training, heard Homer recited. But his real school, that wasn't indoors. It was the Athenian Agora, that buzzing public square.
Oh, marketplace.
The marketplace, the political hub, the social center. That was his classroom. He talked to everyone. Merchants haggling, politicians arguing, craftsmen like his dad, rich young guys hanging around. That's where he learned his craft, the questioning.
He also saw serious action, military service. Your sources really highlight that. Hoplite soldier, fought in big campaigns, Potidaea, Delion, Amphipolis, apparently showed real courage.
Yeah, his military service is very telling, and some sources really emphasize it. As a hoplite, heavy infantry, he'd be fighting shield to shield with his fellow citizens. He knew the reality of war firsthand.
Not just theory.
Not at all.
No.
And this plugged him right into that core Athenian idea, Skratia Iudician Borkuder. Military service is a citizen's duty. It wasn't just a slogan, it was deep-seated. His willingness to do that, to show physical courage for the city, tells you a lot about his sense of civic duty.
Kind of ironic given the later charges.
Exactly. It shows a guy deeply committed to the polls in the most concrete way, putting his life on the line. And that experience definitely shaped his thinking about how ethics and politics are completely intertwined.
So this vibrant, changing Athens, intellectually buzzing, socially shifting, economically booming, that's the world that really forged Socrates, setting the stage for his completely unique way of doing things.
Absolutely. It was this incredibly fertile ground, this intellectual crossroads, and Socrates stood right there, but looking in a very specific direction.
And that direction, that focus, brings us to the ideas swirling around him. Your sources map this out really well. Athens was alive with thought, but you could sort of see two main streams. First, the nature philosophers, the guys we call pre-Socratics.
That's right. These were the earlier thinkers, mostly before Socrates' prime. They were looking outwards at the cosmos. You had Thales wondering if everything was really water, and Anaxagoras talking about a nous, this mind organizing everything. They were asking huge questions about the fundamental nature of reality, the first principles, what's it all made of, how does it work, big cosmological stuff.
And then the other stream, the sophists. Protagoras, Gorgias, totally different focus, turning things inside out almost, became Socrates' main sparring partners, didn't they?
They really did. The sophists pivoted dramatically. They turned away from the cosmos and focused squarely on human beings and society. Law, religion, ethics. They tended to argue these things weren't fixed or absolute, but relative to the individual, to the culture.
Man is the measure of all things.
Protagoras' famous line, exactly. It sums it up perfectly. For them, maybe there wasn't one capital T truth, just what seemed true to you or me right now. And they taught rhetoric not necessarily to find truth, but to win the argument, to persuade, which again was a super valuable skill in democratic Athens.
Now, here's what's fascinating, and a key point from your material. Socrates, while he knew about the nature stuff, he wasn't indifferent, but he deliberately, firmly aimed his focus somewhere else entirely, right onto the ethical questions of life in the polis.
That was his patch.
He was asking these gut-level questions. Okay, what is justice, really? What does it mean to be courageous? And this virtue thing, this arte, can you actually teach it to someone? These weren't just abstract puzzles. They were about how to live right here, right now, in Athens.
Which leads us straight into the Socratic question. And this is where digging into your sources gets really tricky, but also really rewarding. The huge difficulty in separating the historical Socrates, the actual man, from how his students and others portrayed him. It's like trying to see someone clearly, but only through Like 5 different paintings by 5 different artists, all with their own styles and agendas. You need serious critical skills.
Totally. Then the biggest source, obviously, is Plato, his star student. But even in Plato's works, Socrates isn't just one fixed character, is he?
Not at all. It changes.
In the early dialogues, think Apologia, his trial defense, Crichton, about not escaping prison, Euthyphro, on piety, Socrates, comes across as that sharp, relentless questioner, the ethical bulldog, the guy most people picture, right? The master of Elenchus, claiming ignorance but showing up everyone else's.
That's the classic Socrates, yeah. But then, like you say, you move into Plato's middle and later works Phaedon, where he talks about the soul's immortality before dying, the massive republic on the ideal state, Timaeus with its complex cosmology.
The Socrates character changes.
He really evolves. He starts sounding less like the questioner and more like the spokesman for Plato's own fully developed philosophy, especially the theory of forms, this idea of perfect, unchanging ideals existing somewhere beyond our world. So the million-dollar question for scholars and for you listening is that still Socrates talking? Or is Plato cleverly using his old teacher as a character to voice his own big ideas? The line gets incredibly fuzzy.
And it's not just Plato muddying the waters. We've got other contemporary views that make the Socratic question even harder to pin down, like Aristophanes' comedy, Clouds. It's a satire performed while Socrates was still alive, and it paints this completely different, almost cartoonish picture.
It really does. Aristophanes makes him look ridiculous as bag-mouthed sophist hanging in a basket, staring at the sky, babbling about gnats' feet or whatever. He lumps him in with the very sophists Socrates was always criticizing.
Which is ironic.
Hugely ironic.
Yeah.
But it tells you something important about public perception. It's less a philosophical critique and more a snapshot of how some ordinary Athenians, maybe artisans, traditionalists, saw these new intellectuals. Suspicious, maybe a bit angry, feeling like these guys were undermining everything. It shows the anxiety in the air.
Then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got Xenophon. His memorabilia gives us yet another Socrates.
Xenophon, yeah. He was a military guy, a historian, also knew Socrates. His Socrates is much more, well, conventional, pious, practical, conservative almost, giving straightforward advice on managing your affairs, being a good citizen, being virtuous in a very down-to-earth way.
Less philosophical fireworks.
Much less.
Yeah.
It's more about practical morality. It probably reflects Xenophon's own pragmatic outlook. And maybe he was also trying to defend Socrates' reputation after his death, show he wasn't impious or corrupting, but actually a solid, beneficial influence. So you end up with these 3 wildly different portraits: Plato's evolving philosopher hero, Aristophanes' crackpot caricature, and Xenophon's sensible moral guide.
Wow.
Which means, as your sources carefully argue, we have to be critical readers. We can't just pick one and say, that's him. We have to weigh the biases, the context, the author's purpose for each one. It's like detective work with conflicting witness statements. And that challenge is key to understanding any major figure from the past, especially from antiquity.
So, given this elusive guy, this shapeshifter who didn't write anything, how did he actually do it? How did he communicate, challenge people, leave this massive mark? Through his method, right? The famous Socratic method.
His method is absolutely his signature. It's the core of what he did. This distinctive 2-part conversational technique he used relentlessly out in public in the Agora. It's what made him famous and ultimately what got him into so much trouble.
Okay, so the first stage, the sources call it Elenchus. Refutation, cross-examination. This is where he takes someone's definition of something, say justice, and just starts asking questions. Sharp, precise questions, step by step, digging deeper.
Until, almost inevitably, the person contradicts themselves or their definition falls apart. It's like he's logically dismantling their certainty piece by piece.
Sounds kind of brutal.
It could definitely feel that way.
Yeah.
It often led to what's called aporia, this state of confusion, being totally stumped. But the goal wasn't just to humiliate someone, though I'm sure it felt like that sometimes.
Yeah, I bet.
The deeper aim was to clear away the rubble of false certainty, to show people they didn't really understand things they thought they knew. Socrates believed people held on to these fuzzy, unexamined beliefs, doxa, just opinion. And the first step, the absolutely crucial step towards real knowledge, was realizing you don't know. You have to clear the ground before you can build something solid. Elenchus was the demolition phase.
Which sets up the second stage perfectly, maieutic or midwifery. Once the false ideas, the doxa, were cleared out, Socrates would help the person give birth to the knowledge he believed was already inside them. Like a midwife helping a mother deliver a baby.
Exactly. He called it the art of the midwife. He saw himself as just assisting the delivery, not implanting his own ideas. He genuinely seemed to believe the truth was latent within the individual, waiting to be uncovered through guided questioning. He wasn't lecturing, he was facilitating discovery.
And this connects to his most famous line, right? I know that I know nothing. It's not just humility, is it?
No, it's much more than that. It's the absolute foundation of his method. He believed the biggest roadblock to learning anything true was thinking you already knew it when you didn't. This presumed knowledge, often propped up by social status or just habit, makes you intellectually lazy, dogmatic.
Gons you.
Totally blinds you. If you can genuinely admit your ignorance, then the door to real inquiry swings open. It's a radical call for intellectual honesty, for starting from a place of not knowing.
It's vital to stress, though, as your philosophical sources do, that his goal wasn't just tearing people down, even if it felt rough. He was genuinely trying to get toward a shared, solid understanding, a universally valid definition of justice or courage, something everyone could agree on through reason, objective truth, not just winning the argument.
Absolutely his goal. But that wasn't always how it came across to ordinary Athenians. They often just saw this annoying guy asking tricky questions, making important people look foolish. They confused his method with the word games of the sophists, who were sometimes just about winning debates for money or show.
So they thought he was just another tricky talker.
Pretty much. That misunderstanding was fatal. They saw him not as a truth seeker, but as someone cleverly messing with the youth, undermining traditional values, just stirring the pot, not guiding people to wisdom, but leading them astray. That perception gap, fueled by suspicion and maybe some bruised egos, ultimately led to his trial and death.
It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How does that apply to you listening right now? How often do we hold beliefs without really probing them, defend ideas we haven't fully examined? The Socratic method, even just thinking about it, kind of forces you to confront your own assumptions. It's uncomfortable, sure, but maybe liberating, too.
It demands real courage, intellectual honesty from everyone involved.
Yeah.
And this method wasn't just a technique.
Yeah.
It was deeply connected to a set of ethical ideas that were truly revolutionary for his time, ideas that still challenge us.
Right. And maybe the biggest one, the one that still sparks debate, is what's called moral intellectualism. This really bold idea that knowledge and virtue are basically the same thing. He asked that provocative question, who does evil willingly?
And his answer, consistently across the sources you provided, is startling. Nobody. Socrates believed wrongdoing, evil, comes purely from ignorance, from not truly grasping what is good.
So if you knew what was good,
You'd automatically do it. You couldn't choose otherwise. Therefore, virtue is knowledge. This was totally radical. Back then, virtue was often tied to your family, your status, maybe just following the rules. Socrates grounded it in rational understanding, something potentially accessible to anyone who put in the intellectual work, not just the elites. Vice, then, is basically an intellectual mistake, a failure to understand.
Okay, wait, so it's not about bad intentions, just bad understanding. That's deeply unsettling, isn't it? It messes with our whole idea of blame. If it's all just ignorance, what about responsibility? And think about what that means for your own efforts to be a better person. It shifts everything towards education, away from punishment, right?
It absolutely does. That's the revolutionary sting in the tail. If all wrongdoing is just an intellectual error, a failure to grasp what truly benefits the soul, think about the implications for justice, for free will. Moral improvement becomes an intellectual journey, a constant quest for clearer understanding. The solution to vice isn't locking people up, maybe, but enlightening them. Imagine trying to run a society based purely on that.
Wild. And then there's his daimonion, that inner warning or divine sign. Your sources make it clear. It wasn't telling him what to do. It was just this inner voice, this feeling that stopped him when he was about to do something wrong. Oh, don't do that signal. Never do this.
The daimonion is fascinating and, pretty mysterious. Even the sources debate it. But it seems like one of the earliest glimpses of what we might call individual conscience, especially within the context of Athens' very public state-run religion with its pantheon of gods.
It was personal.
Intensely personal. This private, inner divine nudge, separate from sacrificing to Zeus or Apollo in the temple. That was seen as weird, maybe even dangerous. It became a major part of the accusation against him that he didn't believe in the city's gods and was bringing in new deities. It looked like he was putting his own inner feeling above the gods of Athens. A radical move, really, prefiguring modern ideas about individual moral judgment.
So putting it together, Socrates thinks if you truly know the good, you'll do it. And he's got this personal inner stop sign, the daimonion, keeping him from messing up.
That's the core. And like you said, it's a challenging package. Is morality really just about knowing? What was this inner voice? It suggests this deep inner conviction, this personal hotline to truth that, as we'll see, he valued more than life itself.
Mm.
And these ideas, combined with his prickly method, were on a collision course with the political chaos engulfing Athens.
And the fuse that lit that explosion was the Peloponnesian War, starting in 431 BCE.
That war was just catastrophic for Athens. Not a quick conflict. Decades of brutal fighting against Sparta. It absolutely wrecked the city's prosperity, shattered the optimism of that golden age. Pericles' grand vision, replaced by endless war, a horrific plague that killed maybe a third of the population, harbor blockades causing starvation.
Total nightmare.
Total nightmare. It bred suspicion, paranoia, economic ruin, and savage political infighting. Athens was traumatized, polarized, and looking for someone to blame. A very dangerous time to be asking uncomfortable questions.
And during these incredibly messy years, some of Socrates' associates became really controversial figures. People like Alcibiades, brilliant general, but totally unreliable, and Critias, who turned into a brutal tyrant. Now, it's crucial, Socrates wasn't teaching them political tricks like the sophists. He was just talking with them, asking his questions.
But the association was toxic, especially in that post-war climate. Alcibiades famously betrayed Athens, defected to Sparta, caused huge damage. Even worse was Critias. After Athens lost, Critias became a leader of the 30 Tyrants, this vicious oligarchy backed by Sparta.
A reign of terror.
Absolutely. They executed thousands, drew out democracy. So the fact that these notorious figures have been seen hanging around Socrates talking philosophy, it fed directly into that narrative.
Yeah.
Socrates corrupts the youth. Even if he wasn't teaching them how to be tyrants, the connection looked terrible. He became guilty by association in a city scarred by defeat and civil war, desperate to find scapegoats.
So when the 30 tyrants were overthrown and democracy finally staggered back, they declared a general amnesty, trying to heal, move on. But these things often have unspoken exceptions.
And Socrates, tragically, fell into that gap. In 399 BCE, just a few years after democracy's return, 3 men brought formal charges. Meletos, a poet, Anytos, a powerful figure, leader of the Tanners Guild, a democratic politician, and Lycon, or
Chill.
familiar,
Not believing
in the city's gods, corrupting the youth, introducing new deities, that daimonion again. The political tension, the old suspicions fanned by Aristophanes, the toxic association with figures like Critias, it all came together. The stage was set for one of history's most infamous trials.
Tell us about that court system. Very different from ours.
Oh yeah, radically different. It was direct democracy in action. A huge jury, 501 citizens, chosen by lot, not legal experts, just ordinary Athenians.
501. Wow.
Yeah, massive. The idea was to get a real cross-section. No professional lawyers arguing. You had to speak for yourself, though you could hire someone to write your speech. After hearing both sides, prosecution, defense, the jurors voted. Usually dropped a stone or a token into an urn. Black for guilty, white for innocent. Simple majority wins. Huge power in the hands of ordinary citizens, making public perception and rhetoric incredibly important.
And Socrates, in his defense, Plato's Apologia recounts this. He didn't budge an inch, didn't plead, didn't compromise, said philosophy was his divine mission, couldn't just stop.
Refused to back down.
And he famously rejected exile, saying, and this line just echoes, everywhere I go, I will continue to ask questions, just totally committed to his way of life, even facing death.
That refusal to compromise probably sealed his fate. After they voted guilty by a surprisingly narrow margin, apparently they moved to sentencing. The prosecution asked for death. Then Socrates got to make his counterproposal.
And instead of suggesting a fine or something?
He pulls this classic Socratic move. With stunning irony, maybe provocation, he suggests his punishment should be free meals for life in the Prytaneum, the city's Hall of Honor, where they feeded Olympic heroes and generals.
You're kidding.
Nope. He argued he deserved it for being a benefit to the city, stinging them into self-examination like a gadfly.
That must have gone down like a lead balloon. Just sounds incredibly arrogant to a jury that just found him guilty.
Oh, it absolutely did. They saw its utter contempt, mocking the court, mocking their verdict. That definitely pushed more jurors over the edge. The second vote, on the death penalty itself, drinking hemlock poison, passed by a much wider margin, around 280 to 221. His irony backfired spectacularly.
His final moments described so movingly in Plato's Phaedo. He's calm, philosophical, talking about the body as a kind of prison for the soul, arguing for immortality even as the poison is prepared. And then his last words to Crito. We owe a rooster to Asclepius. Don't forget to pay the debt.
That line, so simple yet so profound. Asclepius was the god of healing. Offering a rooster was a common thank you gift after recovering from sickness.
So he's thanking the god for dying.
That's the common interpretation. He's grateful, maybe, for philosophy having cured him of the sickness of ignorance, the illusions of this world. Or perhaps grateful for the soul's impending release from the body, seeing death itself as the ultimate cure, the ultimate liberation. It's this final, coded philosophical statement wrapped in a mundane instruction. Dying as he lived, questioning, thinking, even in his last breath. His death cemented his image. Martyr for truth, philosopher hero. The ripples started immediately.
It's just staggering, isn't it? The sheer scale of his influence, given he wrote nothing. Yet this guy, just talking to people, sparks generations of philosophy, whole schools of thought.
It really is unbelievable. The most direct line, obviously, is Plato. Devastated by Socrates' death, Plato takes the dialogue form and makes it his own literary vehicle. He builds his whole system, the theory of forms, often using Socrates as the main character. Plato essentially turns Socrates into this philosophical saint, enshrining him forever.
And Plato's student, Aristotle, another giant. He went in a different direction, more empirical, focused on logic, biology.
Right, Aristotle diverges quite a bit from Plato's idealism. He's much more interested in analyzing the physical world, classifying things, form and matter. But, and this is key, he systematizes that Socratic method of dialectical inquiry. He turns it into formal logic, the rules of argumentation, definition, classification. That became the absolute foundation of Western logic for over 2,000 years. So the Socratic impulse gets formalized by Aristotle.
And beyond that direct line, your sources show his ideas popping up everywhere in the Hellenistic schools that followed.
Oh yeah, his influence spread like seeds in the wind. You get the Cynics, Antisthenes, Diogenes living in his barrel. They took Socrates' indifference to possessions and status and pushed it to the absolute extreme. Radical simplicity, living according to nature, rejecting all conventions.
The ultimate rebels.
Totally. Then the Stoics, Zeno, and the rest. They picked up on Socrates' idea of living in harmony with reason and the universe and built this incredibly influential system around cosmic law, virtue, emotional resilience, living according to nature, accepting what you can't change. Hugely popular, especially with the Romans later.
And even Epicurus, usually seen as the opposite, focusing on pleasure.
Even Epicurus. His focus on pleasure wasn't about wild parties. It was about achieving ataraxia, freedom from disturbance, from fear, especially fear of death. And his early critiques of Socrates actually helped shape that. He offered a different path to tranquility, but arguably still echoing Socrates' detachment from worldly anxieties, just framed differently.
And it doesn't stop there. Rome, Cicero calls him the founder of philosophy, the guy who brought it down from the heavens to human life. Early Christians like Justin Martyr and Augustine saw him as this pagan saint, someone who grasped moral truth through reason, using as a daimonian idea to talk about conscience.
It just keeps going. Renaissance thinkers like Erasmus admired his courage to die like Socrates. The Enlightenment guys like Voltaire used him as a symbol against dogma and superstition, championing reason and free speech. He kept getting reinvented for new battles.
But not everyone was a fan. Modern reactions get really complex, sometimes critical, as your sources show. Kierkegaard, the existentialist.
Kierkegaard loved Socrates, saw him as the father of subjective inwardness. He used Socrates' focus on self-examination, on passionate individual commitment, to attack the big, abstract philosophical systems of his day, like Hegel's. For Kierkegaard, Socrates represented the authentic, choosing individual.
Then there's Nietzsche, with a very different take.
Oh, Nietzsche had major issues. He famously argued that Socratic rationalism, this relentless focus on reason and logic, actually killed Greek tragedy. He felt it suppressed instinct, passion, the darker, necessary parts of life, the Dionysian, in favor of this cool, clear, Apollonian rationality. He saw Socrates as a turning point, maybe even a decline.
Wow. And even someone like Wittgenstein.
Wittgenstein, especially later Wittgenstein, had this idea that philosophy is a disease that needs to be cured. That sounds critical, but it echoes Socrates' midwifery, right? Philosophy not as building grand theories, but as therapy for the intellect, untangling knots in our thinking, clarifying language, dissolving problems rather than solving them. A very Socratic kind of task in a way.
And incredibly, his actual method is still used today. Education uses Socratic inquiry, getting students to question, discover, not just absorb facts. Law schools famously use the Socratic method to grill students, make them think on their feet, analyze arguments.
It's amazing, isn't it? Connect the dots like your sources do, and you see Socrates isn't just some figure stuck in ancient Athens. He became an idea, a symbol, a technique, a lens generations keep using to examine their own questions about knowledge, ethics, society. His legacy isn't a monument, it's a living conversation, constantly being reinterpreted and argued over.
Which brings us right back to the core problem central to your material. How reliable are those lenses? How solid are the sources? Let's look at the actual evidence, starting with archaeology. Is there much?
Honestly, shockingly little. The only really solid archaeological trace from his time is a mention of his son, Lamprocles, listed as an Athenian sculptor on some official records. That's about it for concrete, undisputed physical evidence directly tied to Socrates himself. No statues commissioned by him, no house identified.
So those busts we see everywhere, the ones with the snub nose and bulging eyes, not really him.
Almost certainly not direct likenesses. Those little terracotta ones found. Probably mass-produced popular items, heavily influenced by Aristophanes' caricature in clouds. They're playing on a stereotype, maybe for laughs or ridicule, not capturing reality.
And the famous marble portraits.
Most of those derive from Roman copies,
Yeah.
made centuries later. They're based on an idea of what Socrates looked like, likely idealized, filtered through Roman artistic tastes. So even visually, we're dealing with interpretations, not photographs.
Okay, so archaeology is thin. What about the texts? That's where the real action is, but also the real complexity, right? Textual criticism.
Absolutely the core challenge. Take Plato's dialogues again, our richest source. Modern scholars, philologists spend careers doing incredibly detailed analysis. They track subtle changes in Plato's Greek syntax, his vocabulary, the concepts he uses, references to historical events, all to try and figure out which dialogues are early, middle, or late.
Why does that chronology matter so much?
Because it's crucial for that historical Socrates debate. It helps us argue. Okay, is this passage likely Plato faithfully reporting his teacher's views, more common in early dialogues? Or is this Plato using Socrates as a character to explore his own mature philosophy, like the theory of forms, more likely in middle and late dialogues? It lets us try carefully to separate the student's ideas from the teacher's. It's painstaking work, constantly questioning Plato's own developing thought and authorial intent.
Then you've got Xenophon's writings, very different feel from Plato.
Totally different flavor. Xenophon was a soldier, a practical guy. His Socrates gives sensible, down-to-earth moral advice. How to be a good citizen, manage your household, be pious. It's valuable, gives us another angle, but it's less philosophically explosive than Plato's version. More concerned with everyday ethics than revolutionary ideas. Maybe a bit safer.
And Aristophanes' clouds. We keep coming back to it.
Because it's important, but not as philosophy. As your historical sources stress, it's best read as social commentary. It shows the suspicion, maybe fear, that ordinary Athenians felt towards these new intellectuals challenging tradition. It tells us how Socrates was perceived by some as a weirdo, maybe dangerous, lumped in with the sophists rather than analyzing his actual thought. It's a window onto Athenian anxieties.
So here's where it gets really interesting, methodologically. We're trying to reconstruct this hugely influential figure using these incredibly different puzzle pieces, idealized portraits, practical snapshots, outright caricatures.
It's kind of amazing he inspired such different reactions, isn't it, that so many people felt compelled to write about him, even if they disagreed wildly or had different agendas. It means our picture of Socrates is always going to be multi-layered, fragmented, maybe even contradictory. It's a dialogue between the sources themselves.
Which really drives home the need for critical thinking when we look at any historical figure, but especially one like Socrates. You can't just grab one source and say, this is it. You have to juggle them all, weigh the biases, understand the contexts. It shows history isn't just facts, it's interpretation, which is what this deep dive is all about, using your sources.
And that process of interpretation continues right up to today. Socrates' legacy is still alive, still contested. Look at the contemporary critiques coming from fields like feminist philosophy or post-colonial studies, which some of the modern analyses you provided explore.
Right. They don't necessarily erase his importance, but they definitely add crucial layers of nuance and critique.
Exactly. Feminist readings, for example, might point to the assumed gender roles in the dialogues, or how that famous midwifery analogy, the Maieutic, while brilliant, uses women's essential labor childbirth as a metaphor for male intellectual discovery, even while women themselves were largely shut out of that intellectual life.
It's a powerful point. The metaphor elevates an experience central to women, yet the context excluded women from the conversation itself. It shows how even revolutionary thinkers are embedded in their time, reflecting its limitations.
It highlights a structural blind spot inherent in the society. And post-colonial studies offer another lens, critiquing the whole myth of Athenian democracy.
How so?
They emphasize that even Socrates' passionate arguments for freedom, intellectual freedom, Freedom of speech operated within a system built on radical exclusion. His idea of the citizen explicitly left out huge groups: medics, foreign residents vital to the economy, all women, and the massive population of slaves.
So freedom for some, not all.
Precisely. While he pushed boundaries, his world was still profoundly unequal and exclusionary by our standards. These critiques don't say he's irrelevant. They say we need to see him in the full, complex, often uncomfortable context of his actual society, acknowledging both the breakthroughs and the blind spots your sources reveal.
Which raises that big question for us and for you listening. How do we hold both things at once? How do we recognize Socrates' foundational importance while also acknowledging the biases and limitations of his time brought to light by these modern critiques?
It's the central challenge, really, for engaging responsibly with history and for ethical reflection. These critiques enrich our understanding. They show Socrates not as some timeless, perfect sage floating above history, but as a real person, a product of 5th century Athens, who nonetheless managed to ask questions and model a way of thinking that transcended his time and set incredible things in motion. It's about seeing the whole picture, the genius and the context.
So wrapping up this deep dive, we've journeyed from Socrates of Athens, buzzing and changing, through his unique questioning method, his core ideas about virtue and knowledge, his dramatic trial and death, and then tracked his echoes through millennia, right up to these contemporary debates, all drawing on the rich material you provided.
What really strikes me looking back is how Socrates arrived just as Athens was shifting its focus from cosmic mysteries to human values. He wasn't the first philosopher, but he made the courage to question in public an ideal, that unexamined life, not worth living. He lived it and died for it.
He literally changed the game without writing a word, just by talking, asking. He became the embodiment of the philosopher through his actions, his willingness to face death for his principles. A living question mark.
Yeah, absolutely. And that whole tradition of critical reason in the West, you see its DNA everywhere, in law, science, ethics, education. You can trace so much of it back to those relentless questions in the Agora. It's a continuous thread of inquiry.
For 2,400 years, people keep rediscovering him, heroizing him, fighting against him, being deeply uncomfortable with his questions. But the core questions themselves, how should I live? How do I know what I claim to know? What's the right thing to do? They never go away, do they? They just morph to fit our times. But they're still right there on our agenda.
And that, I think, is the most powerful takeaway. Socrates isn't just Athens' dialogue. He's the ongoing, never-ending dialogue of philosophy itself.
So what does this all mean for you listening? It means Socrates isn't just history, he's an active conversation, a challenge to your own assumptions, an invitation to that deep self-examination sparked by these incredible sources you brought us. Maybe the most Socratic thing we can do after all this is just to keep asking those questions ourselves.
Right.